Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and in that remarkable span of time, he believed he had witnessed every conceivable human emotion play out on his stage. He had seen families celebrate victories with unbridled joy, watched contestants freeze under pressure, witnessed reunions between long-lost relatives, and heard countless personal stories that ranged from heartwarming to heartbreaking. Yet, on this particular Thursday afternoon in October 2024, something was about to unfold that would shake him to his very core and remind millions of viewers that some truths carry such weight that they require a lifetime of courage to speak aloud. Before we delve into this extraordinary story that stopped production in its tracks and left an entire studio speechless, if you appreciate hearing tales of courage, redemption, and the transformative power of truth, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories matter, and your support ensures that more voices like the one you are about to hear can reach the hearts of people who need them most. The Henderson family from Birmingham, Alabama, had traveled to the Family Feud studio with the kind of nervous excitement that typically accompanied game show appearances. They were a multi-generational group that embodied the warmth and closeness that made for compelling television. Leading the family was 45-year-old David Henderson, a high school principal with an easy smile and natural charisma. Beside him stood his wife, Patricia, followed by their 2 adult sons, and finally, at the end of the family line, David's father, 78-year-old Thomas Henderson. Thomas cut a dignified figure in his charcoal gray suit, perfectly pressed white shirt, and burgundy tie. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and despite the tremor that occasionally affected his hands, he stood with the bearing of a man who had spent his life carrying himself with purpose and pride. His dark eyes, though lined with age, possessed an intensity that suggested a sharp mind still very much engaged with the world around him. There was something in his expression, a combination of determination and barely contained emotion, that caught Steve's attention during the initial family introductions. During the opening segment, where Steve typically engaged in light banter with the families, he made his way down the Henderson family line, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. When he reached Thomas, the older man gripped Steve's hand with surprising firmness and held it perhaps a moment longer than social convention dictated. "Mr. Henderson, it is an honor to have you here," Steve said warmly. "Your son tells me you worked as a mechanic for 50 years. That is an incredible career." Thomas nodded slowly, his jaw tightening slightly, as if he were holding back words that wanted desperately to escape. "Thank you, Mr. Harvey. I did my best to provide for my family and serve my community." There was a formality to his speech, a careful precision that suggested every word was chosen deliberately. Steve, with his finely tuned instincts for reading people, sensed something beneath the surface, but moved on to keep the show's pacing intact. The game proceeded through its usual rhythm. The Henderson family faced off against the Martinez family from Texas, and both groups displayed the competitive spirit and good humor that made Family Feud such enduring entertainment. Thomas participated when his turn came, providing thoughtful answers that demonstrated his keen understanding of human nature and common responses. Yet, throughout the game, those watching carefully could see that his mind seemed elsewhere, as if he were rehearsing something, preparing himself for a moment that had not yet arrived. The Henderson family ultimately prevailed in the main game, winning decisively and earning the right to play fast money for the $25,000 prize. As the family gathered to decide which 2 members would participate in the bonus round, Thomas did something unexpected. He stepped forward and placed his hand on his son David's shoulder. "Son, I would like to play fast money if you will have me," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the studio with unexpected strength. David looked surprised. They had discussed earlier that he and his oldest son would play the final round, as they had practiced together and felt confident in their chemistry. but something in his father's expression made David reconsider. "Of course, Dad," David said, embracing his father. "I would be honored to play with you." The first round of Fast Money proceeded normally, with David answering the 5 questions quickly and accumulating a respectable 137 points. That meant Thomas needed 63 points to secure the $25,000 prize for his family. As Steve walked Thomas to the podium for his turn, the older man's hands were shaking noticeably, though whether from age, nerves, or emotion was impossible to determine. "Mr. Henderson, you ready to bring this home for your family?" Steve asked with his characteristic encouragement. Thomas looked directly at Steve, and in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition that something significant was about to occur. "Mr. Harvey, I am ready to do what I should have done 60 years ago." Steve's eyebrows raised slightly at the cryptic response, but he continued with the game setup. "All right, sir, you know how this works. 5 questions, 20 seconds. Just say the first thing that comes to mind. Your son got you 137, so you need 63 points to win." Thomas nodded, positioning himself at the podium. His hands gripped the edges as if steadying himself for more than just a game show challenge. The familiar timer appeared on the screen, and Steve launched into the rapid-fire questions. "Name a reason someone might skip their high school reunion." "Shame," Thomas answered immediately, his voice clear and firm. "Name something people do when they cannot sleep at night." "Remember their mistakes." Steve paused almost imperceptibly at the unusual specificity of the answer, but continued. "Name a place where people go to think." "Church." "Name something you wish you could take back." "Words left unsaid." "Name a reason someone might keep a secret for decades." "Fear." The buzzer sounded, and Steve stood looking at Thomas with an expression that had shifted from his usual game show enthusiasm to something more contemplative. The answers had been unusually heavy, unusually personal, and Steve's instincts told him that this was about to become more than just a game. "Those were some interesting answers, Mr. Henderson," Steve said carefully. "Let us see how you did." As they moved to reveal the scores, Thomas remained remarkably still, his eyes fixed not on the board, but on some distant point, as if gathering courage from an invisible source. The first answer, shame as a reason to skip a high school reunion, registered as the number 2 answer with 18 points. The audience applauded politely. The second answer, remembering mistakes for what people do when they cannot sleep, was not on the board. The audience made a sympathetic sound, but Thomas showed no reaction. Church as a place where people go to think came up as the number 3 answer with 14 points. Words left unsaid for something you wish you could take back was the number 1 answer with 34 points, bringing Thomas's total to 66 points. The audience erupted in celebration. The Henderson family had won. They had crossed the threshold needed for the $25,000. But as his family rushed to embrace him, as Steve prepared to deliver his congratulatory remarks, Thomas raised his hand. The gesture was so commanding, so filled with authority, that everyone immediately fell silent. "Mr. Harvey, I need to say something," Thomas said, his voice now trembling but determined. "I need to say it now, on this stage, in front of all these people and the cameras, because I have been a coward for 60 years, and I cannot die a coward." Steve Harvey froze. The celebration stopped. The studio fell into a profound silence. Steve looked to his producers, who were equally uncertain about what was happening, but something in Thomas's demeanor made it clear that this needed to unfold. "Mr. Henderson," Steve said gently, moving closer to the older man. "What do you need to say?" Thomas took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 6 decades of suppressed truth. In 1964, I was 18 years old, living in Birmingham, Alabama. It was the height of the civil rights movement, and our city was a battleground. I worked at my father's garage, and we served everyone who came through our doors, black and white alike, because my father believed that a man's troubles had nothing to do with the color of his skin. The audience was completely still, sensing they were about to hear something profound. One evening in June, a young black man named James Williams came to our garage. Thomas continued, his eyes now glistening with unshed tears. His car had broken down a few blocks away, and he needed help. It was late, nearly closing time, and my father had already gone home. I was there alone, finishing up some paperwork. Thomas's hands gripped the podium tighter. James was 22 years old, studying to be a teacher. He was polite, respectful, desperate for help because he needed to get home to his wife who was 9 months pregnant with their first child. I told him I would fix his car. I told him to wait while I got my tools. But before I could do anything, 3 men pulled up. White men. Men I knew from around town. Men who had been drinking and were looking for trouble. Steve stood completely motionless, his face reflecting the gravity of what he was hearing. They saw James standing outside our garage, and they decided he was their entertainment for the evening, Thomas said, his voice beginning to break. They got out of their truck with baseball bats. They started yelling slurs, threatening him. James looked at me, standing in the doorway of that garage, and he asked me for help. He said, "Please, sir, I just need to get home to my wife." He was terrified. He was a human being in mortal danger, asking another human being for help. Tears were now flowing freely down Thomas's weathered face. And I did nothing. I stood there in that doorway, and I did nothing. I told myself I was outnumbered. I told myself that if I intervened, they would come after my family. I told myself that there was nothing I could do. And while I stood there, telling myself these lies, those 3 men beat James Williams so badly that he spent 6 weeks in the hospital. The studio was so quiet that the sound of people crying could be heard clearly. Steve's own eyes were filled with tears. James survived, Thomas continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. But he lost sight in one eye, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He never became a teacher because of the brain injury he sustained. His daughter was born 2 weeks later, and he could barely hold her because of his broken ribs and fractured arms. And I never said a word. I never told anyone what I witnessed. I never testified. I never came forward. I let those men walk away, and they never faced justice for what they did. Thomas looked directly at Steve, then at the camera. For 60 years, I have carried this shame. For 60 years, I have told myself that I was just a kid, that I was scared, that there was nothing I could have done. But the truth is, I was a coward. I chose my own safety over another man's life. I chose silence over justice. I chose comfort over courage. Steve moved closer to Thomas, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder as the older man continued. "I went on to have a good life," Thomas said, his voice filled with self-recrimination. "I married a wonderful woman. I had children and grandchildren. I built a successful business. I went to church every Sunday and prayed for forgiveness. But no matter how much I prayed, no matter how many good deeds I did, I could never wash away the stain of that night. I could never forget the look in James Williams's eyes when he realized I was not going to help him." Thomas's whole body was shaking now. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, maybe less. And I realized that I was going to die carrying this secret, and James Williams would never know that someone witnessed what happened to him, that someone knew the truth, that someone remembered. The revelation about his terminal illness sent a wave of audible emotion through the studio. I tried to find James, Thomas continued. I hired a private investigator. I searched records. I did everything I could. And I found out that James Williams died in 2019, at the age of 77. He never knew that I witnessed his attack. He never knew that I could have helped him get justice. He died not knowing that someone saw, that someone remembered, that someone carried the weight of that night for all these years. Thomas looked at his son, David, who was openly weeping. My son did not know this story until 2 weeks ago, when I told him why I wanted to come on this show. He did not know that his father, the man he looked up to his whole life, was a coward when it mattered most. But I needed to tell him. I needed to tell everyone. Because the truth is the only thing I have left to give. Steve Harvey, a man who had built his career on humor and quick wit, stood before Thomas with tears streaming down his face, at a complete loss for words. I cannot ask James Williams for forgiveness, Thomas said, his voice growing stronger despite his tears. But I can tell the truth. I can stand here in front of millions of people and say that I failed. I can say that silence in the face of injustice is itself an injustice. I can say that fear is not an excuse for cowardice. I can say that I am sorry, even though James will never hear it. Thomas turned to face the camera directly. If James Williams's daughter is watching this, if his grandchildren are watching this, I want them to know that their father and grandfather was a brave man who faced terror with dignity. I want them to know that he asked for help, and he deserved to receive it, and I failed him. I want them to know that he mattered, that his life mattered, that what happened to him mattered, and that I have remembered him every single day for 60 years. The older man's voice cracked with emotion. I am donating the money we won today to the Southern Poverty Law Center, to organizations fighting for civil rights, to causes that honor the memory of people like James Williams who suffered because people like me chose silence over courage. It will never be enough. Nothing will ever be enough. But it is what I can do. Thomas looked back at Steve. I came on this show because I knew it would be seen by millions of people. I knew that if I told the truth here, in this public way, I could not take it back. I could not hide anymore. I wanted to die having finally done one brave thing, having finally spoken the truth that I should have spoken 60 years ago. Steve Harvey stepped forward and embraced Thomas, holding the older man as he wept. The studio audience rose to their feet, but this was not applause. This was something else entirely. This was witness. This was acknowledgement of a truth so painful, so necessary, that it transcended entertainment and became something sacred. When Steve finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion. Mr. Henderson, what you just did took more courage than most people will ever have to summon in their entire lives. You cannot change the past, but you just changed the present. You just taught millions of people, including me, that it is never too late to tell the truth. It is never too late to acknowledge our failures. It is never too late to say I am sorry, even if the person we hurt is no longer here to accept it. Steve turned to address the camera directly. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take a break. We need a moment. Mr. Henderson needs a moment. We all need a moment to process what we just witnessed. During the commercial break, something extraordinary happened. Production assistants, camera operators, audience members, and the competing Martinez family all approached Thomas. They did not offer congratulations or casual comfort. Instead, they simply stood with him, bearing witness to his confession, honoring his courage, sharing in the weight of what he had revealed. David Henderson embraced his father for several long minutes, whispering words that only the two of them would ever know. When they pulled apart, David spoke loud enough for those nearby to hear. Dad, you taught me to always tell the truth, even when it is hard. I did not know that lesson cost you so much. I did not know you were teaching me from your own pain. But I understand now. I understand that real integrity means admitting when we have failed, not hiding it." When the show resumed, Steve made an unusual decision. He abandoned the remaining planned segments and instead facilitated a conversation about racial justice, moral courage, and the long shadow that historical wrongs cast over the present. Thomas participated, answering questions from Steve with the same raw honesty that had characterized his confession. One audience member, an elderly black woman, stood up during this conversation. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Henderson, my uncle was beaten by white men in Mississippi in 1965. Nobody ever came forward. Nobody ever testified. He died 5 years ago, never knowing if anyone even remembered what happened to him. What you did today, telling the truth about James Williams, it matters. It matters to my family. It matters to all the families who never got justice, who never got acknowledgement, who never got someone to say I saw what happened, and it was wrong." Thomas looked at her with profound gratitude. "Thank you for saying that. Thank you for witnessing my confession. I do not deserve forgiveness, but I am grateful to be heard." The episode aired 3 weeks later, and the response was unprecedented in television history. The segment of Thomas's confession was shared millions of times across social media platforms. News organizations picked up the story. Civil rights historians provided context about the violence of the 1960s and the culture of silence that had allowed so much injustice to go unaddressed. But most remarkably, Thomas's confession sparked a movement. Encouraged by his courage, other elderly individuals began coming forward with their own long-held secrets about injustices they had witnessed during the civil rights era. A website was created where people could share testimonies, and within months, it had collected over 1,500 accounts from individuals who had witnessed racial violence and had remained silent for decades. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which received Thomas's prize money, announced they were creating the James Williams Truth and Reconciliation Fund, dedicated to documenting untold stories of civil rights, era violence, and supporting families still seeking answers about what happened to their loved ones. Perhaps most movingly, Thomas received a letter from James Williams's daughter, Dorothy Williams Johnson, 2 weeks after the episode aired. She was 60 years old, a retired nurse living in Atlanta. Her letter was read on Steve Harvey's talk show, with Thomas present. In the letter, Dorothy wrote that she had always known her father had been attacked, but the details had been vague, and her father had been reluctant to discuss it, not wanting to burden his children with the trauma. She wrote that learning the full truth, though painful, had brought a sense of closure she had not known she needed. She wrote that knowing someone had remembered her father, had carried the weight of that night for 6 decades, had finally told the truth, meant more than Thomas could possibly understand. Most powerfully, Dorothy wrote that she forgave Thomas. She wrote that his courage in coming forward, especially in his final months of life, demonstrated a commitment to truth and justice that honored her father's memory more than silence ever could. She wrote that she hoped Thomas could find peace in his remaining time. When Steve finished reading the letter, Thomas wept openly. "I do not deserve her forgiveness," he said, "but I am grateful for it. I am grateful that James Williams raised a daughter with such grace, such capacity for forgiveness. He must have been an extraordinary father." Steve arranged for Thomas and Dorothy to meet in person, and their conversation was filmed for a special episode that explored themes of truth, reconciliation, and the long journey from silence to speaking. Dorothy brought photographs of her father, showing Thomas the young man whose life had been forever altered by that night in 1964. They sat together for hours, with Dorothy sharing stories of her father's life, his determination to overcome his injuries, his commitment to education despite never becoming a teacher himself, his love for his family. Thomas shared every detail he could remember about that night, answering Dorothy's questions with painful honesty. He described her father's courage, his dignity in the face of terror, his desperation to get home to his pregnant wife. The conversation was difficult, heartbreaking, but ultimately healing for both of them. Thomas Henderson passed away 4 months after his appearance on Family Feud, surrounded by his family. In his final weeks, he received thousands of letters from people thanking him for his courage, sharing their own stories of long-held secrets and the liberation that came from finally speaking truth. He spent his remaining energy responding to as many as he could, encouraging others to speak their truths before it was too late. At his funeral, Dorothy Williams Johnson attended and spoke. She told the assembled mourners that Thomas Henderson had given her father's suffering meaning by refusing to let it remain hidden. She said that truth-telling, even decades late, was an act of love and justice. She said that Thomas's courage had inspired her to become more active in civil rights work, to use her father's story to educate younger generations about the importance of speaking up in the face of injustice. The episode featuring Thomas's confession became required viewing in high schools and universities across the country, used to teach about civil rights history, moral courage, and the importance of speaking truth to power. Mental health professionals noted that it sparked conversations in therapy sessions about long-held secrets and the psychological burden of silence. Steve Harvey later said that meeting Thomas Henderson and hearing his confession had fundamentally changed his understanding of courage and redemption. He said that Thomas had taught him that true bravery is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what is right, despite fear, even if that decision comes late, even if it comes at great personal cost. 1 year after Thomas's death, a scholarship fund was established in his name at the University of Alabama, specifically for students studying civil rights history and social justice. The scholarship criteria required applicants to write essays about moral courage and the importance of speaking uncomfortable truths. Dorothy Williams Johnson served on the selection committee, ensuring that her father's legacy and Thomas's final act of courage would continue to inspire future generations. The memorial plaque for the scholarship includes a quote from Thomas's appearance on Family Feud. It reads, "It is never too late to tell the truth. Silence in the face of injustice is itself an injustice. Choose courage over comfort, even if you are afraid, even if it costs you everything." If Thomas Henderson's story has moved you, if his courage to speak truth after 60 years of silence has inspired you to examine your own life and the truths you may need to tell, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with others who need to hear it. Let Thomas's final act of moral courage continue to ripple outward, inspiring others to choose truth over silence, justice over comfort, courage over fear. Because as Thomas taught us in his final months, redemption is always possible, forgiveness can be found even in the darkest places, and speaking the truth, no matter how late, no matter how painful, is the most powerful thing we can do to honor those we have failed and to heal the wounds of history that continue to affect us all.